Hi, this is Yosef. Welcome to a special Hanukkah edition of whatever this is. Um, so Hanukkah, Greeks versus Jews, seems like a kind of appropriate because I've been waiting to talk about something for a little bit. It's an idea I've been developing, and I think Paul's now touched upon it in his latest Exodus series video on kind of going back to Peterson's Genesis series. And it's also been on my mind because of the Vervakae, Jordan B. Cooper, back and forth, whatever you want to call that debate, I guess. So, and I mean, give a shout out to Harry as well, I guess, because this also come up a little bit in our conversations. So, here is a basic difference between the Greek and the biblical conception of man. To the Greek mind, man is above all a rational being. Rationality makes him compatible with the cosmos. To the biblical mind, man is above all a commanded being, a being of whom demands may be made. The central problem is not what is being, but rather what is required of me. Greek philosophy began in a world without a supreme living one god. It could not accept the gods or the example of their conduct. Plato had to break with the gods and to ask what is the good, and the problem of values was born. And it was the idea of values that took the place of God. Plato let Socrates ask, what is good? Yet Moses' question was, what does God require of thee? That's a quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel from an essay probably about 60 years old. And I think it sums up kind of one of the major differences between the Greek and especially Platonic worldview that I would particularly associate with Vervakae and the biblical worldview. Right? So we have, what is being, and we figure out what is being through things like rationality and the intelligibility of the world. And what is good, right? So we have to figure out what the good is in order to pursue the good. This is the Socratic dialogues and that Plato presents, etc. And they might also ask, what is beauty, right? If we're going to talk about, I don't think these are, I think the implication of the three transcendents is kind of an anachronistic one to some extent, from what I understand, but to use that frame for now, the true, beautiful, and good. So we have to figure out what those things are in order to pursue them. And yes, maybe in Neoplatonism they do point to the one, ultimately, but they aren't. You have to figure out what those are first, right? Whereas in Judaism, we ask, what ought we to do? And this is, of course, something that Peterson picks up on really nicely, I think, especially in that Genesis series and in the part that Paul Vervakae highlighted in his last video. And this gets to a much kind of bigger point, which I'm going to start framing the way the Vervakae does, right? That the difference, and this flows through as much as Christianity is similar to Judaism. And there's a Judeo-Christian kind of somewhat shared worldview. This difference between the Greek and the Jewish conception actually really comes out in a similar difference in many ways between I would consider the medieval Christian worldview, at least up till the beginning of the 13th century, and the Jewish one. So the way that Vervakae has framed this, and he's basically done it as a line from the Neoplatonists through Augustine, and at least, let's say, until the rise of nominalism, so Aquinas, is kind of the end of, not the end of this line, but there's a continuous stream through Aquinas, and then maybe we see it picked up in different ways in other parts of Christian tradition later, but let's follow kind of in Western kind of Catholic Christianity. You have the three parts that compose the three orders that create meaning, right, that are intertwined to create meaning. You have the nomological, which is the thing that gives the world coherence, how the world fits together, and this is provided by Aristotle. It is a combination of both how the world operates, so it's perfectly ordered, everything has a reason, cause and effect. You have the kind of the four, what do you call it, like the four reasons, essentially, the four causes of Aristotle. So the the material, the functional, the teleological, etc., right? So these explain kind of the order of everything and how everything fits together, and also how the mind views the world. So you have both kind of the ontology of the world, and then you have the metaphysics of the world, maybe, and the epistemology. So to know something is to understand its form, that you have this deep, as you get to know something better, you understand its structural, functional organization better, how it fits in the world better. And as that kind of gets absorbed into your mind, essentially, right? Your mind, the form fills out. And the more, the better things fit together, the more real they are to you, and the more meaningful one finds them, and one finds one's life in that framework. Right. So this is the nomological order that was provided by Aristotle. This is rather different than kind of the biblical understanding of how the world operates and how the mind views the world. How the world operates is actually quite similar. It's perfectly ordered and everything has a reason, and that kind of God is behind that order. And even when we think we do things, ultimately, like, God makes them work out for the best. I mean, this is, again, in the Peterson lecture that Paul Vanderklay highlighted with Joseph, and no matter kind of what happens to Joseph from his father's favoritism and the dreams, and then being sent to Egypt, and being first in Potiphar's house and then sent to jail, and all the stuff that happens, like, ultimately it all seems, right, the way the story ends is, I know you intended to cause me harm, but God made it work out for the good, is what Joseph says to his brothers at the last chapter of Genesis. So the world operates in this perfectly ordered way. It's monotheistic. There's no dualism. There's no chaos. As much as there is chaos, it is part of creation, right? God creates Leviathan. He creates the deep. He creates whatever it is. It's meant to be there, and it's part of the order. He creates the snake in the garden. He creates the garden. He creates the, death, right? God creates everything. As Isaiah says, He created the good and the bad. So the dark and the light, right? He creates it all. It's all ordered and with a reason. At the same time, how the mind views the world is different than Aristotle, right? So this is an argument. This is not such a. I mean, it's not. I think the best modern takes on this argument have been put forth by Yoram Hazony and Sam Liebens, who have essentially argued that, and anyone who's read Peterson or listened to Peterson, this will not be foreign. The Bible has had this view for a long time, and he's picking it up, right? To believe, lahamin, is something in the Bible, is to have faith in it. So it's not that you have faith that a proposition is true. It's not faith that a proposition is true. It's faith in something. So faith in God is believing, it's just like trusting in God, that God will do what you expect Him to do. Knowledge, dat, which I know Vervakae likes this word, because in the Bible, dat, like God, so I mean, the classic example is man knows his wife, dat, but it's not knows in a propositional sense. It actually can be propositional, but as Sam Liebens has argued really nicely in his essay on the word amen, that is something that comes about from direct contact, and it generally is a combination of what we'd call, in Vervakae language, propositional, perspectival, and participatory. And it could be any one of those three, but it also certainly encompasses all of them. This is very clear in Exodus, when God says the Egyptians will know that I am God, and that they're greater than their gods, and there it seems to be propositional. But then God, like in the next chapter, says, "And you will know me through like experiencing me," which is a very different type of dad, and uses the same word in both. Now the word truth in Hebrew, emet, is not what one is. It's not objective truth. Now it can be, again, like just like that, it can be propositional, but it's much more about what one ought to be. And what one ought to be can only be fathomed by understanding what God's will for it is. So this actually, as we'll see, will tie the nomological to the normative, and eventually the narrative, which are the other two orders to get into, right? So this is a big difference. Truth is not what one is, but what one ought to be, which is, if you remember Heschel's discussion, the question is, what does God require of thee, not what is good or what is true. Right? This is a fundamentally difference between what what is versus what ought. And this also means that the entire question, the whole naturalistic fallacy, doesn't really translate well into kind of Jewish philosophy, because if the world is ordered in the way, so then gets back to how the world operates. If the world is perfectly ordered because what is all fits together, Aristotelian view, that's not quite the same as the world is perfectly ordered because what is what it ought to be, because the perfect ordering comes from a personal God that cares what is and what it ought to be and makes sure that it becomes what it ought to be. And this also gets, of course, into the whole debate over how to translate Ehyeh Asher Hayeh, what God says his name is at the burning bush. I know the typical translation is I am that I am, which ignores the Hebrew grammar, which is either probably closer to I will be what I will be, or I will become what I will become, which I think picks up a little bit better this nuance about this, the is and the ought being much more closely tied in this worldview, in this nomological worldview. Now, the second world order, normative. So Vervakae basically puts this, he ties this to Augustine, let me define what normative is first. Normative is kind of the significance. So how valuable, deep in reality and good are the elements of life. So how do you increase your contact with reality? How do you deepen your contact with reality? How do you pursue the good in life? Right, that's the normative. So the normative, normally we think about morals and things. So things that norms that we would want to pursue. This isn't just because they're social norms or something, but how do you pursue the good? Right. That's and kind of in a Greek view, right, pursuing the good is the same as pursuing what is true at some level, because eventually the good and the true are going to become one at the top, right? So Vervakae roots this in Augustine, right? So he says, so you have Augustine's self-presentation, which is then self-realization, and then eventually self-transcendence, right? So it goes through these stages as you learn about yourself better and better. Eventually you kind of transcend yourself within yourself. It's this very internal, internalized move, deepening your selfness, putting you into closer contact with reality at that same time, making ourselves more real. God is within us. In Scripture, kind of, especially for Augustine, right, serves as an external sign that points us toward a truth that we must recollect, which is the whole Platonic idea of recollecting as learning, right? So the more you learn, remember, recollect, and that is done by reading, let's say, Scripture, for a Christian Neoplatonist, the more you kind of are guided in the way, turning inward and finding the God within you. This is very different. So now I'm not going to talk about the biblical view as much as the rabbinic. We could talk about the biblical normative. The rabbinic normative is going to be using the Torah, and kind of the Torah I'm using here very expansively to mean kind of revelation, Scripture, everything, the oral tradition, the wisdom accumulated through the centuries of Jewish history and culture, and the Torah is using it, both practicing it and studying it, to get closer to grasping God's will, right? So God's will is ultimately what we're trying to get at. God's will for us, what we ought to do, as Heschel said. And how do you get that? Well, the only way to do that is to study God's will and to practice God's will. So it's much more external than internal. We're not looking inward toward kind of self-transcending internally, but it's a very outward looking. At the same time, it's right. It's dialogic with the text, between you and God are having a conversation, essentially, you and the revelation. But it is very much focused on trying to figure out, the better I understand my and align my will and thus my actions with God's will, the closer you become to Him. And this is rooted also in the Jewish concept of imitatio Dei, imitating the God, right? Because that is how you cleave to God. The rabbis say God is a consuming fire. So, right, the burning bush, or even better later in the prophets, I think, maybe, where is it, Amos? Somewhere in there, in the late prophets, God is a consuming fire. So how do you cleave to a consuming fire? You can't get close to a consuming fire. The way you do it is you imitate God. And the idea here is also that if we think more about, let's say, a classical theistic, or the Jewish version of classical theism, right? God is so transcendent, right? We can't know God's essence. We can't access it. All we have access is to God's will. God's will is realized through creation and through revelation, and that the only way to come close to God is to align yourself with His will by incarnating His will in the world. And yes, we could say that, for instance, some people might just limit this to just like bringing, revelation in Scripture, like doing the commandments of the Torah into the world, whether it's kind of a literal reading like the Sadducees, or interpreted through the history of accumulated traditions, and how the tradition says these things are to be embodied, kind of in the more, let's say, Pharisaic rabbinic line, which says this is how they've been embodied since Sinai, or this is how we understand these, and this is how to embody them. We care about the embodiment of these things, the incarnation of them in the world. So we should just look at them to kind of, I would say, a little bit later, the conception that God's will also comes through nature. It's not just through special revelation, and to use the Christian term, but it's funny. The Christian term, but actually the Muslims came up with this distinction between special and general revelation. Well, the Muslims kind of influenced by the Midrash, but so through Jewish influence. So by the time you get to Maimonides, the first step to kind of getting, before you start this whole journey of like, let's say, high-level Torah study, first you do the commandments, and you get a basic understanding of the commandments and, let's say, special revelation, and then you work on mastering kind of what he considered like I call them the STEM subjects, right? Understanding science, math, especially astronomy, biology, and like figuring out the structure of the world as God revealed, through God's kind of general will, how it was created. And then kind of the higher level, let's say, more esoteric metaphysics, and kind of Kabbalah, like the type stuff, right? Like the secrets of the creation and the higher level intellectual, like, understanding of God's special revelation. So you can kind of see, there's a balance between these things, and there's kind of an incorporation, let's say, of the more Greek idea at some point. But the normative, but it's all, right, it's at a lower level, right? In the sense of we're doing this, we're learning, let's say, Greek wisdom in order to understand God's will better, and not because it's, we've identified this Greek stuff as having some sort of good or beauty or truth that's separate from God. Nor is it trying to figure out like what is for the sake of what is. We're not pursuing science for the sake of itself. But the thing at the top of the hierarchy is God. And God, specifically God's will, right? We're not going to find out anything about God's essence. The best we're going to find out is kind of the equivalent of God's logos, right? The structure, God's will as it's ordered through the universe. But again, it's not as much as what is as what ought. So it's kind of, there's this tension, right? So you kind of have the what is and what ought. Maybe you have what is from, let's say, the Greek wisdom, and what ought to be from special revelation. And they're beginning maybe to be separated a little bit at some level by the time you get to Maimonides, but they're not, we don't experience, and I'll talk about this at the end. You're not going to experience modernity in the same way, certainly not at the same time. And then the third order that I wanted to just mention is the narrative, right? So the narrative, Vervakae says, this is the Judeo-Christian concept of linear time. You have creation, fall, redemption, or creation, incarnation, eschaton structures. This is more generally a sense of purpose, right? So here's the narrative structure of either your life or of history, more generally. The history of your religious tradition, the history of the world, the history of the cosmos. Now, it's not really Judeo-Christian, because the Bible, as was pointed out, shortly after the idea of linear versus circular time was proposed in the late 19th century, within a couple of years, Rosenzweig basically had written, you got to, who wrote that? Iliad? That he didn't quite get it right. That religious time, and he actually talks about both Christian and Jewish, but religious time is, say Jewish time, but also, he gave Catholic as an example, is really spiral. Because it certainly has cycles, right? Liturgical time has a strong secular nature. The Sabbath is every week. You have the same prayers every day, essentially. You have the festivals every year. You have the monthly cycle, the yearly cycle, even 7-year cycle, 50-year cycle. But there's also the strong linear sense, right? So it's really a spiral. It's spiral time. You have linear and circular combined going forward, because you're not coming back to the same place. Every Sabbath is not the same as the last Sabbath. Each Sabbath, in fact, right, and every day, and every week, and every month, and every year, and every 7 years, you should be deepening that relationship with God and God's will, and learning these concepts and ideas, and studying Torah and getting deeper. Right, this is the upward and inward structure that keeps, it goes forward, but it's also going around, right, at the same time. And of course, the other big difference is, instead of having, like, say, creation, fall, redemption, or creation, incarnation, eschaton, which are the Christian versions of that narrative, the Jewish one is, to use Rabbi Sachs's kind of shorthand, is creation, revelation, redemption. It's slightly different, right? And this is also, super fractal structure. We can see it basically everywhere. Creation, revelation, redemption happens just in the books of Exodus, across just the book of, I would say, Genesis, across the whole Torah, across the entire Tanakh, and kind of even more generally through, like, history itself, like all of envisioned history. So there's some major differences here, because the two worldview never really fully develops. We had a hint of it, as I said, in Maimonides, but for the most part, we don't ever get a hard dualism, in part because God is beyond, the essence of God is always beyond the world. God, right? We don't have the Logos as, like, part of God. It's God's will, and it's an emanation of God into the world, but it's really closer to his energies, to use kind of an Orthodox language, Christian, Eastern Orthodox language. So we never get the full two worlds view that, let's say, develops in Aquinas and then into a lot of Western Christianity. Especially because around the same time as Maimonides, you also have Kabbalah coming on the scene, which is going to be panentheistic, and be, kind of this dynamic monism, or dynamic dualism. I don't even want to call it, but it's not really a monism or dualism, right? There's the God that transcends the world, but then everything that's in the world is immanent, including whatever elements of the divine. And you don't have kind of a separate spiritual versus physical realm, but both kind of neither in the Maimonidean or the Kabbalistic concepts, or kind of their precursors. We definitely do get the idea of self-negation of our will before God's, but it's not framed as a battle in the same way, let's say, that Eckhart sees it, or later Luther, or Augustine necessarily. There's tension, but it's not the same. It's not seen as a battle because it's also not framed in a dualism, right? It's not like, well, in Kabbalah it kind of becomes more of this, but you don't really see Satan versus God in the same way. We have a Yetzer HaTov, Yetzer Hara, which are like the good and evil inclinations, but they even like the evil inclination can be used for good. It's not like essentially evil or irredeemable, and it does not need to be destroyed. In fact, right, if it gets used, it can be used for the good. And there's some interesting things, because there's actually things within, I would say, like Occam, that are actually kind of close to Maimonides in some ways that I would not have expected. Because, right, for Occam, the way he turns away, right, from Aquinas in some ways is that, like, God's will is key, and the way he turns away from, let's say, the Greeks in some ways, right? God's will is the key, not reason. and we would agree on that, right? God's will is above reason, and supersedes reason. But then, right, Occam then kind of goes further than we would, and in part because I think he's reacting so strongly to that which is before, so he kind of maybe overcorrects from my view, right? So God isn't bounded by rationality. Okay, fine. There are Jewish perspectives that argue that back and forth, but generally, that's okay. I mean, the idea that miracles can happen kind of show that God can go beyond rationality at some level, certainly beyond, let's say, the natural order. But then, right, Occam goes really far, because then he says reason is not central to God, and there's no assent to reason. It's gone, right? And that's like, that we would see problematic, because, and here I think non-nominalist Christianity kind of would agree with us, and I think that stream certainly exists in Christianity, right? Where you like, even if God's will is ultimate, God did communicate a lot of that will through general revelation, which is intelligible, and even in special revelation, even the Torah has a huge amount of coherence and consistency to it. It'll never be complete, but there's quite a lot of underlying logic and reason. Now, we can never say that we really fully know the reason, understand the reason. We can posit theories, and we can do our best. And different generations might have different ways of understanding it, and we can't. We have an idea that you don't say this is the reason we do this commandment, because we don't really know. Unless God tells you this is the reason, you don't know. And if you got the reason wrong, and then then you're not gonna, and you don't do the commandment because you think you know why God told you. Well, you're not really following God's will then, right? You're following your reason over God's will. Now, Occam also thought the order, right, because the reason is gone, that order was arbitrary. Now, this is interesting, because I just said that God uses reason, but at some level, I actually sense that this is similar to an argument Maimonides makes, essentially, around Plato's Euthyphro dilemma, right? So this is talking about Greek-Jewish kind of dialogue, right? The Euthyphro dilemma is, did God create the world? Sorry, that's not it. I'm going to do it in the monotheistic version, but you can substitute for the polytheistic if you want. Does the good exist independent of God? And then when God does something good, it's because, like, okay, here's a list of good things, God's going to do the good? Or is it good because God does it? No, this only really can happen, as Heschel pointed out, because the Greeks separate God and the good in a very specific way, or the gods from the good in a very specific way. And they can do this, of course, because the gods are not particularly good or bad. They tend to be often bad for polytheists, and especially the Greeks. They don't necessarily act morally. So it seems almost obvious that the gods are not good for the Greeks. And when they do the good, it must be independent of them, because it's Irenic and they are agentic, and it is separate. Maimonides argues forcibly against this, that for a monotheistic religion, this doesn't quite make sense, that God, by creating the world through his will, kind of defines the good, and therefore whatever is good because it's kind of baked into reality as being good. And this is one of the ways that kind of solves the izot problem, because it doesn't mean that reality is good. It doesn't mean that everything that happens in nature is good, but it means that everything that ought to be is good the way it ought to be, even if it doesn't get realized as it ought to be. Truth is good. Emet is good, because when emet is fulfilled, when someone is emet, when someone is true, they act true to themselves. They act true to the way, well, not to themselves, it's actually, they act true to God's will, then they are good. So it is semi-arbitrary. So those are some differences, but we can definitely see, it's interesting that some of the ideas of nominalism have have kind of these strong Jewish roots. And actually, I've mentioned this before, that this is also true for the Renaissance and humanism, that a lot of kind of, and Protestantism in general, a lot of things would happen when, during the Reformation and the Renaissance, is you start having Jewish and also Islamic ideas creeping into Christianity. And in some ways it enriches it, and I think leads to a lot of the good things that kind of come out. And it's, and this whole debate over like Luther and his influence on, the Reformation and, different parts of what ends up happening in modernity, it's actually really complicated. It's a much more complicated conversation because it's not even Christianity kind of imploding on itself and like ideas with some parts of Christianity kind of being focused and refocused, but it's also this new streams from other philosophical systems. Obviously, the resurgence of Greek thought, classical thought in the Renaissance, in part mediated by Arabs and Jews through translations. But it's also more than that, where you have a new attempt to finding equilibrium between these ideas, and sometimes there's no equilibrium. Sometimes there's just fundamental tensions, and people are trying to make coherent sense out of things that are really hard to fit together. And some of these things, as I pointed out, like some of these things, for I think Occam is a good example. The Christianity kind of, let's say, went too Greek in one direction, maybe, and then he's reacting maybe a little too strongly, counter-reacting, right? And then you're going to have kind of an attempt to find a new equilibrium, but it's going to kind of oscillate. It may or may not be stable, depending, right? Sometimes oscillations dampen out, sometimes they grow. Systems are complex. So, and I wanted to finish up just looking at modernity for a second. So, you have this stuff, 13th century, into the 14th century, the Black Death, emergence of commercialism, new math, emergence of secular states, and new math coming from the Arabs, mostly, a little bit from the Jews and the Indians, emergence of secular states and norms, emergence of the concept of risk, and you have all these things that essentially threaten both the control of the church and also kind of its mostly it's kind of nomological and normative worldviews. You have the two worlds, the divided man kind of breaking up the normative to some extent, as we see in the debate between Vervakae and Jordan B. Cooper. And we have the change in the nomological, and also the change, obviously, in the social cultural structure. But a lot of this really threatens science, and specifically Aristotelian science, right? And because of that, right, it starts to unravel these things that give meaning to the world for medieval Christians. However, for Jews, because science is so much less central, because, right, it's all about God's will, and even the incorporation of, let's say, general revelation into God's will as like being something worth studying is both fringe and really recent in many ways by the time of the 14th century, right? You have kind of Maimonides and the school of rationalists mostly based in Spain and a little bit in Italy, and after the Inquisition in the 15th century and the Jews being expelled from Spain, you have that spread a little bit more into Italy, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire, but not so much, to be honest. I mean, outside of kind of Italy and Spain, Portugal, after they got expelled by the Alhambra decree in 1492, you see a lot of that kind of die out. There's some stuff in Italy during the Renaissance, and then there's kind of the centers of Western Sfarad, so London, Amsterdam, I guess Venice, Salonika, but outside of a couple major cities, and eventually New York, I guess, you really don't see a lot of Jews pursuing science and math for now. Like, there'll be a couple centuries gap essentially, and it's not central to the meaning making in Judaism. So the Copernican revolution just doesn't have the same effect for a number of centuries. We don't become radically disconnected from the world, from our sense of meaning, and we also don't understand evil as chaos in the same way, because especially Platonism and kind of the way Satan works in a lot of Christianity is more of a dualism. It's still let's say it's still monotheistic. To the degree that Trinitarianism is monotheistic, but like the dualism between good and evil just doesn't play out the same way in Judaism for the most part. So the definition of matter is minimally challenged. The fact that science is proving that matter obeys even like regular laws actually helps reinforce, as much as that does trickle down into Jewish thought, it's actually great. It reinforces the idea of general revelation is actually well ordered and rational, and Occam, that part of Occam is wrong, and that's fine with us. What's going to threaten Jewish meaning and create what I would call the Jewish meaning crisis isn't going to happen for quite a long time, until the really Jewish emancipation, when Jews are allowed to become citizens, or maybe just before, in the early 19th century, but sometime between, let's say, the 1820s and the 1850s, when there starts to be real challenges to the authenticity of the Bible as the Word of God and as a historical document. Because if everything's rooted in trying to figure out what God's will is, and that's the source of your narrative, normative, and nomological understanding of the world, then if there's something that threatens the Bible as being dictated by God to Moses, well, the Torah is being dictated by God to Moses, and then the rest of the biblical corpus, the history of the Bible, the archaeology of the Bible. So that's really going to be the Weissenschaft, which is kind of what we call 19th century biblical and Jewish scholarship, academic scholarship, as opposed to kind of traditional Jewish scholarship. That's going to really threaten how we understand the world in a fundamental way, and this is where you really see like the first, widespread meaning crisis in Judaism, and people leaving their communities, not practicing, not finding meaning in it, and really, right, and this is where you start seeing Jews turn to other idealistic movements, because the narrative never really fully dies away, right? So Jews are very attracted to idealistic movements, utopian movements, messianic movements. So, you see this really strongly, obviously, in Jewish Zionism and communism and socialism. And those are non-religious, right? They're replacing, for us, right? There are people who essentially are leaving, almost all of them, with the exception maybe some of them more moderate socialism. All of them are essentially by people leaving religious Judaism and like looking for another spiritual system to kind of fill that void. Of course, a lot of them also just become disconnected and unaffiliated and don't join any of these movements. Some of them, they immigrate to places all over the world, mostly, America, Canada, Australia, South Africa, the UK. They often, marry Christians. Some of them, pre-1850, a number of them converted to Christianity. After that, it becomes rarer, because once Jews become citizens, like the ethnic group, right? Because Christians, because of this gets more complicated. Peace of Westphalia, the religious wars, the rise of secularism, only applied to Christians. Jews were not considered part of these religious states and systems, for the most part. A rare exception, let's say, being America, in the late 18th century, when George Washington supports their rights to be citizens, and there's some stuff before that too. A lot of the states had religious freedom. That was really, of course, rare from a lot of places where these people came from. Before, let's say, 1848, the revolutions of 1848, and the reforms that got passed, especially before Napoleon, before 1803 or 1802, Jews were not considered citizens in almost any country, and if they wanted to get rights, even if they stopped practicing their religion, it didn't matter. They had to accept Christianity, get baptized, usually take a Christian name, depending on whether they're married or not. Usually they'd marry a non-Jew, or they'd have to marry a Christian, or if they were they would have to not just get baptized, but they had to baptize their whole family, depending, in order to get to be accepted as citizens, to get rights, to be able to serve in the army, to have weapons, to own land, depending on the country, to be allowed to join a guild. Right, there's a reason, right, Jews kind of had their own banking systems, because they weren't allowed to join guilds, and that's how the guilds essentially served as credit systems. That's how you did credit. The early credit systems are all through guilds, with the exception of kind of this ethnic group that had been excluded from the system, that basically developed its own way to do credit, and that's how that's the root of that. Is also why this is assist to Paul if he's here, but why I strongly suspect that Paul's ancestor converted to Christianity, given the timing that he did and stuff, from what we can tell, is before Jewish emancipation in the Netherlands. If you wanted to be kind of a respectable member of society, if you wanted to go to university, if you wanted to, lots of reasons. You would, if you didn't feel strongly connected to your Judaism, let's say you had a meaning crisis, which specifically hit earlier in the German and Dutch and Western Sephardi-speaking lands, where they were pursuing, let's say, more science, and they were pursuing Jewish biblical academics were penetrating much more quickly and earlier, then you would convert. People also convert for other reasons. Sometimes they were forced to, especially in Eastern Europe. Sometimes, they didn't want to face the violence of pogroms and things, and those could be pretty bad. And the other reason people converted was for love, right? You couldn't marry outside of your religion, whether you're Christian or Jewish. You had to convert. So if you fell in love with someone who's out of the religion, that was the only way to do it. So those are kind of the big reasons. But a lot of the conversions in the early 19th century, just before emancipation, you see a lot of that. Benjamin Disraeli is another example. Marx, right, his family, another example. But it's just like, it's across the board. You see any kind of the famous Jews of the early 19th century, essentially, right, they're ethnic Jews who convert, for the most part. And some of them kind of stay in this ambivalent, right? Disraeli says he's the blank page between the Old and the New Testament, right? He's this ambivalent kind of edge case. Conversion goes down quite a bit after emancipation, because there's no reason to convert. You could be Jewish ethnically and don't have to practice anything and be a fully accepted member of society. So yeah. Anyway, so those are a whole bunch of ideas between kind of that trace the lines between Greek and Jewish, and you can kind of see, hopefully, where Christianity kind of is more Greek in some ways. Vervakae certainly highlights the Greek side of this. And in some ways, I think, especially in the parts of Peterson that, a lot of the parts that Paul was picking up on in his last video, with the exception of understanding Cain's children as kind of the genocidal giants, almost all the other themes that he picked up on are kind of, when you're just reading the Old Testament in its own context, much more aligned with the Jewish reading. Very kind of focused on how to be good, what ought to do in the world. The only thing I would say, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again for people who haven't heard me say this, or just because it's worth repeating, is that there isn't only one way to be good in the world. There's one set of commandments. There are some differences, obviously, not some large, some small, depending, let's say, on man, woman, priest, non-priest. And obviously there's a very big difference in commandments between Jews and non-Jews. Fine. But there are essentially large groups of people who are commanded to do the same set of things. On the other hand, every person has a different ought in the world. Each person has their own mission in the world. Like you're each created for a different reason that God wants them to be. And while there's kind of a general baseline of these are the commandments are kind of the bottom. This is a procedural and kind of, I'd also say, kind of poetic narrative way to approach the world that gives you kind of the basis for meaning, but they're at the bottom. From there, as Maimonides points out, in, let's say, the most developed version of the normative order, though at least the earliest, most developed version, except one of the earlier ones. I guess there's a couple. But there are, from there, right, there's deepening your knowledge and wisdom. But what that means is not figuring out reality to a deeper extent. It's figuring out God's will to a deeper extent. Deeper understandings of the commandments, right, they're, how do you say it in English? Or maybe Greek. Right, there's kind of the simple meaning and the simple understanding and practice and like what they meant contextually, historically, maybe. But then you have kind of the allegorical meaning and the symbolic meaning and the, I guess, the anagogic or the esoteric meaning. And there's layers and layers and layers. And those layers are not, right, a lot of those are going to be integrated and unique to each person and their, how, right, every, this idea, I'm going to close with this, is this idea that, let's say, specifically said about the Jews, but we could apply it in some ways universally. So that there's one letter of Torah in the Torah for every Jew. So every person is a letter, and only together so this is, you have to understand, if a single letter is missing from a Torah scroll, it's not kosher, you can't use it. Every single letter matters. It has to be in its right place. It has to be the way it ought to be. It's the way it is, but the way it ought to be. And together, they form the entire narrative in the text, right? You need that letter in the right place to make the word make sense, to make the sentence make sense. And every single letter also leads to mountains of exegesis. So all those things are connected. Anyway, have a good night.